Welcome to the Better Wealth Show. This is The Exchange. We're going to be talking about tariffs, the good, the bad, the ugly, and we have experts on both sides of the aisle. The person that is going to be debating the anti-tariff approach is Phil Magness, an American economic historian who holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University and currently serves as a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. He's also the author of multiple books, including The 1619 Project, a critique, and has been published in Wall Street Journal and New York Times. On the flip side, the two people that are very pro-tariff is economist Ian Fletcher, is one of America's foremost experts on the problems of free trade, and he's the co-author of the new book, Industrial Policy for the United States. He's also joined by his other co-author, Marc Fasteau, who is the founder of the American Strategic Insurance Group and also a Harvard Law graduate. Phil, if you want to start, we'd love to hear a 5-minute or so just premise of your belief as it relates to tariffs, as it is a big hot button right now.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for having us here for this discussion. But I guess I can start us off by saying it's been a very tumultuous about a month now that Trump's been in office. And we've gone through several iterations of tariff policy, including earlier this week, he imposed 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum coming in from countries abroad. As I look to these policies, though, I am deeply skeptical about what they portend for the economic course of the Trump administration. And I say so because Trump himself does not seem to know entirely what he wants to get from tariffs. Tariffs are essentially a tax. They're written into the Constitution as a tax mechanism, but they actually serve a couple of different purposes. And in the course of just 3 weeks, Trump has tried out all three of those major purposes multiple times, often in contradictory ways. The first is protectionism, an attempt to bolster up domestic industry against its foreign competitors. And Trump does seem to believe that protection is a desirable thing, although we can debate the merits of that because it does involve giving a benefit to one industry, but also raising costs on other industries that now have to pay the tax itself or pay increased costs for the tariff good. So protectionism is his one objective. Second, he's floated this idea of replacing the income tax and the IRS itself with something he calls the External Revenue Service. This is using tariffs to raise money for the federal government and pay for things the government does. Now, this is interesting from a historical perspective because we used to do that. From the founding era, the first Congress in 1789 up until 1913, tariffs are the dominant mechanism that funds the federal government. But this comes with a couple caveats. First off, they don't raise nearly as much money as income taxes. And the second, that objective of raising money off of tariffs is in tension with, in fact, it's at odds with the objective of protecting industries. Because if you protect an industry, you actually are deferring purchases of imports to the domestic seller of the same good. On the other hand, if you want to raise revenue from taxes, you actually need those imports to cross the border so you can slap a tax on them and get some intake to the government. So we have this great tension coming out. If Trump tweets on one day he wants protection and the next day he wants revenue, I'd say to him, pick which one of the two you want, because you can't have both. And then the third thing he does is he says tariffs are a negotiating bluff, a tool to try to get other countries to come on board with objectives that he wants. And he's floated things, everything from enforcement of drug traffic, crossing the borders, the fentanyl crisis, to he wants other countries to pay more of their defense share and joint allied operations of things like NATO. And he's saying that we're going to threaten tariffs, essentially, to bring that about. But again, the negotiating bluff is at odds with those other two goals, because the whole point of the bluff is you use it as a tool to get the other country to do something, and then you withdraw from that tool and end up actually not getting tariffs. And that's what he attempted to do a couple weeks ago when he threatened Canada and Mexico with 25% across the board tariffs as a negotiating bluff. And then he says he got a deal, is actually acquiescence to commitments that both of those countries had made in the previous year to the Biden administration and had made previously to Trump in his first term, but nonetheless, he used this argument of the bluff. So my point to this is, Mr. President, you need to pick one of the three things as your main policy objective, and then we can actually discuss the pros and cons, the trade-offs between them. Now, I'd say there's also an added harm in here, and that is the chaos factor. Every time Trump changes between one of these three objectives for tariffs, the stock market crashes, cryptocurrency goes crazy, supply chains and orders for goods that are dependent on raw materials, for example, that are crossing border, get paused or disrupted until that particular tariff is actually resolved. And every time he does this, it breeds further uncertainty in the markets. Well, uncertainty is not good for long-term economic growth. Now, we actually did get a tariff put in place earlier this week. This was the steel and aluminum tariff. And he said he ostensibly was doing this to target China's aggressive movements in these two markets. And China is a major producer of steel and aluminum. And these are seen as geopolitical economic events. But actually, if you look at the current trade volume of the United States, where are we importing steel and aluminum from? It's not China. China, in fact, is number 10 on the list of steel importers into the United States, behind such places as the Netherlands. Most of our steel actually comes from Canada and Mexico. So the incurred cost of this tariff is actually on two friendly neighbors, not this adversary across the seas. So again, I'd ask President Trump, what are the objectives here in picking a trade war with two friendly countries that seem to be economically integrated into the U.S. economy, including under a trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated in his first term as president? Why are we disrupting that? We already see some of the repercussions, because when you do put tariffs on goods from abroad, that actually instigates other countries to retaliate against the United States itself, to target our exports to the rest of the world. So this raises the second question here. If tariffs are disrupting markets internally with increased costs and uncertainty and potential supply chain pauses and disruptions, what are they also doing abroad? If other countries retaliate against us and target our exports, then this original stated goal of rebalancing trade in America's favor actually goes out the window, because foreign countries are targeting U.S. goods with their own retaliatory tariffs. This in turn hurts our own export market. That's essentially where I would summarize the current state of affairs. So I guess we can turn it over and go on to the
and
next
before we turn it over to Ian, I cannot wait to hear just your State of the Union kind of deal on this. The big talking point when it comes to tariffs is that you're passing on the tax to the consumer, and it makes things more expensive and inflation increases. Is that, I know I'm oversimplifying that, but is that, like, would you agree with that mentality of like tariffs? Trump is saying that tariffs are going to raise money for the government, potentially floating the fact that we don't have to pay income tax, which gets the base excited.
Right.
But at the end of the day, would you say from an economic standpoint, it increases expenses it's like a tax, and technically it's a tax on the people that potentially could afford it the least? Is that a
tariff at its base is a tax. That means somebody has to pay it. And economists refer to this as tax incidence. Who incurs the burden of it? And it's not always the directly taxed firm, because if you're a seller and you have the ability to do so, you pass it on through cost to other sellers down the line, who eventually pass it on to consumers. So that's basically where we're at.
Ian, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we went 8 minutes on this end, and so feel free to State of the Union, and then Mark, if you have things after Ian is done, I might create a follow-up question as well. So
take 5 minutes, and I'll take 3.
Okay. Ian, it's all you.
Hi, my name is Ian Fletcher, and I'm a member of the advisory board of an organization called the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is a nationwide tariff group, and you can find us at prosperousamerica.org. I'm also the author of this book, which came out originally in 2010, Free Trade Doesn't Work. And so I think I can fairly claim just a little bit of prescience as to what's happened in the last 13 years, because I did predict that free trade wouldn't last and it was going to blow up into a giant set of controversies. Now, in terms of what Phil said, I want to begin by saying that the three-way trilemma you announced is you can't have tariffs for revenue and protection and political leverage. I'm afraid tariffs have been used for all three simultaneously for as far back as the records go, which is about 500 years. You're correct that sometimes these purposes can run into contradiction. Yes, they can. That's true of a lot of foreign policy issues. But the idea that you have to pick one, it may make a good soundbite. It's not true. Now, second point I'd like to make is I mentioned economic history. Economic history, if you want to understand all this stuff, is your friend. Because theoretical economics, which you mostly get spooned out in economics departments and the people who quote them, like the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, they're going to tell you free trade, free trade, free trade. According to their model of the world, free trade was the best thing. It was good for us even if we didn't think it was. It was going to lead to balanced trade. It was going to lead to prosperity. It was going to do all these wonderful things, which it hasn't done. So, if you want to understand the real economics of this, turn to economic history. Particularly, you can look at America's own history, because we were a tariff-protected country right from when we started out as an agricultural banana republic and eventually became the greatest economic power the world had ever seen. Now, the next thing I want to tell everyone is you have to understand that tariffs are not an ideology. It's not like tariffs are either good or bad, and if you're in favor of tariffs, you're in favor of all tariffs everywhere, of whatever amount, whatever industry, whatever country, or the opposite. Tariffs are a policy tool. So Phil is absolutely right that some people, possibly including the president, would like to think that tariffs on their own can accomplish all sorts of desirable objectives that in fact they can't do. And that is absolutely true, and neither I nor my co-author would deny it. And it's not what we said in the book that we just finished writing. Tariffs are one policy tool out of about 2 or 3 dozen policy tools that form the larger constellation of what we call industrial policy, which means policies based on the idea it matters what industries a country has. And the economics of one industry, from an analytical point of view, can be different from the economics of another industry. So, in terms of Phil's point that tariffs on their own will not bring about balanced trade, that's pretty much what we say in the book. We say tariffs are a legitimate tool, but if you really want to balance America's trade, you need to bring down the overvalued dollar, because if you have a tariff of 15% and then the dollar is overvalued by the best estimate we recently made was 16%, well, then your dollar overvaluation more than cancels out your tariff. So if you bring the dollar down, you'll bring your imports down. And then the bonus of dealing with the dollar rather than tariffs is it also makes your exports go up because it makes your exports more competitive internationally. So if tariffs can't do that, what are they good for? Well, what tariffs have that currency and other measures don't is tariffs are industry specific. For example, one of the last things Biden did on his way out was to preemptively impose a prohibitive 100% tariff on imports of Chinese electric cars. Now, we think that was a good thing. Why? Because electric cars are the future. So if America does not have an electric car industry of its own, it's not going to have a car industry at all. And if you don't have a car industry at all, not only do you have the employment issues and the suppliers and the bankruptcies and the communities that are destroyed, you also have a gigantic national security problem because you won't have the industrial base for building the mechanized equipment that you need to win wars. The U.S., since about 1990, has gotten real lazy about its security. You can't defend your country with websites and leverage buyouts on Wall Street. You can only defend your country with pieces of machinery that are usually made of steel or aluminum, and they're packed with electronics, and they have an energy source. So the national security issues alone basically mandate that the United States maintain a first-class industrial base. That is to say, an industrial base that has capabilities equal to anyone else in the world.
Yep.
Anything they can build, we can build, and we can build it at scale. So it's not just a one-off customized hot rod, but you can do what we did in World War II, where we had giant factories that were producing more aircraft, more tanks, more everything than the other side. And a lot of people will tell you that if you want thriving industries, free markets are your best bet. Well, that's just not empirically what we have seen under free trade. We've been deindustrializing at a rapid pace. And the final point I'm going to make is that when we say free trade, it means free trade for America. It means our border is open to the passage of goods. It does not mean other countries are also free, regardless of what agreements they may sign at the WTO. There's a short list of other countries that have real-ish free trade, the UK, Australia, a few others. When you're dealing with China, they're blatantly and criminally dishonest about violating it. When you're dealing with Japan and Korea, they're not criminal, they're generally not blatant, but they're very, very sneaky about dishonoring the free trade agreement. And when you're dealing with the Europeans, they do the same thing in an exquisitely polite, politically correct way, but we call that mercantilism.
Okay, can I step in here?
Yeah, Mark, your Ian left you 5 seconds, so maybe, but I'll let you make a quick summary. Yeah.
Okay, I just let me talk about tariffs with more specificity. Okay, let's take the Trump steel tariffs. Okay, everybody, usual free traders had their hair on fire. We're going to have terrible price increases and so on. So what actually happened? The price did tick up a little bit when the tariffs were first put on. A year later, what do we have? There's a 2.4% one-time price increase in the price of steel. There is $16 billion of investment in new steel plant, most of it greenfield, most highly modern, efficient facilities, and you have more good-paying jobs. So that's the actual fact. That's what happened. Now, why did it happen that way? Why? The problem with the predictions that are made about what tariffs are going to do and all the horrible things that are going to happen is that they ignore a number of, it's a static prediction. They're static predictions. It doesn't take into account the investment inducing effect of tariffs. Something similar happened with the washing machine tariffs. Also, prices went up, more investment in, there was domestic competition, prices came back down, and there were more good manufacturing jobs in the United States. So they also, the predictions that they're going to have such an awful effect on the U.S. economy also assume that tariff revenues are going to be sequestered, that they're not going to be turned back into the economy one way or another through tax breaks or government spending. And there are 3 or 4 other assumptions that are built into all these doomsday models. Now, as Ian said, not everything should be tariffed. The most efficient tariffs are those that are put on industries that are what we call advantageous, that can make more investment, absorb more investment productively, are on the leading edge of technology, are important for the future.
Okay, so in summary, you would just say that just like I summarized for Phil, tariffs from a standpoint potentially increase for consumers. You would say that it increases jobs in the United States, and it doesn't increase the price dollar for dollar for the tariff.
It's definitely not dollar for dollar. It's definitely not
Okay.
dollar for dollar because the exporters eat some of it. But yes, it's designed to be a tax, as Phil said, on the purchases of these imported goods. If it doesn't, as Phil also said, if you just use it for revenue, you're not
Yep.
achieving the fundamental purpose of the tariff, which
Okay,
is to
so
reduce.
what I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to get into, I'm going to talk about some current events, and then I'm hoping we can have a great discussion this next hour. The question I have for you is, if you could wave a magic wand when it comes to tariffs, what would you do? Would it be 25% across the board? Like what type of, and if you could answer this quickly, I just want to know where your thoughts are, because I don't hear too many people wanting the US dollar to be lower. And like that's not a talking point that I don't think Trump would run on. So what
No,
would you say ideally?
that's in his memorandum, his America First trade memorandum. He does talk about getting the dollar down to a level which balances trade. So that
Okay.
is yeah. But to answer your question, the most efficient tariffs from our point of view are those that protect what we call advantageous industries that need the protection.
Okay.
So those are, they either employ a lot of people at decent wages, or are in industries which are the future. Or they're high value now. They pay good jobs.
Are you talking like electric cars would be an example of
Cars,
that?
yeah, cars are mid-tech, electric or
Okay.
kind of high tech.
So with
But
that point, I would love to send this over to Phil and just ask you just to respond to that. What is an ideal tariff? What percentage?
Well, I'm a free trader, so I'd say zero to go on the complete other end of it. This could give us some fun debate. But you look into this, and I realize the arguments are made that strategic industries are beneficiaries of protection or should be targeted. I'd pose two questions. First is, who picks the strategic industry? I think both of y'all have said electric cars are the future. Who decided electric cars are the future? In fact, if we look at market tests right now, the vast majority of cars on the roads are traditional internal combustion engines. They seem to be far more popular. Yes, there is a market for electric vehicles, but it tends to be oriented around the cities. And you actually see this in the rental car industry. People overwhelmingly prefer gas vehicles. You can get a steep discount for a Tesla if you go to almost any airport rental car agency in the country, because nobody wants them. That they have limitations on their range and all sorts of features of it. So I even question this very premise: what makes electric cars the industry of the future that we should pick as a winner through government policy?
Are you a
And then
climate change denier?
Yeah, let
Are you a climate change
Phil talk about
denier?
the second, and then we'll
yeah,
let you guys respond to that.
yeah.
Second thing.
So the second component I'd ask, yes, a tariff absolutely does deliver a benefit to that protected strategic industry. If we put a tariff on steel, the steel industry loves it. They get to charge higher prices for their goods. It's great if you're in the steel industry because you are a beneficiary of that protective rent that's delivered over by the mechanism. But actually, who pays the cost? Well, if it's spread out to consumers across the country, it may not be dollar for dollar, but we should also ask the question, how do we weigh the costs and benefits? And it turns out most evidence of this, the aggregate costs of the tariff that's imposed spread out across 330 million consumers in aggregate is larger than the benefit that's delivered to a couple thousand or maybe 10,000 people working in the steel industry that are specific beneficiaries of this. So we actually have to ask the question, are we picking an industry as a winner here because we think it's strategic, and yet spreading the cost of that on a far greater number of people? What's the net here? Are we actually benefiting the country because we picked that one industry?
well, the models that produce those results are the same GTAP models that have been used for decades. Their predictions have been uniformly wrong because they ignore the long-term beneficial effects of increased investment, increased production that reverberate through the economy. And it's not just the steel producers that benefit from increased investment. The whole economy, you know how the effects ripple out to the rest of the economy, and the fact they also assume that the tariffs are all absorbed by by purchasers, and they're not. So, and the other part of your thing is, okay, if we don't pick what industries we consider advantageous and strategic, we're letting the Chinese decide for us because they will subsidize whatever they think industries they want to dominate, to the point if we don't protect ourselves from them, in the long term, we're a colony. And they're doing all the high tech, expensive, high value stuff because they subsidize the hell out of it. Your argument assumes that that a free market is the way everybody operates, and all these choices are made by a free market. But if you look at a list of the most high important innovations of the 20th century, they're all funded initially by the government, not often supporting it in a particular company, but supporting a portfolio of different approaches to a problem or a technology that's recognized as having great potential benefit, and which has turned out. Everything in the iPhone, every technology in the iPhone was funded initially by the US government. So the idea that these things you could just leave it entirely to the free market doesn't fund breakthrough technology until
So
it gets to the point.
you're saying that the government creates innovation? Like most of the innovation that we have today is that the U.S. government invests, and
To a
because
certain
I don't know if I agree with that, but I
up to the point where it becomes ready for the U.S. for the private sector's investment horizons and investment and risk tolerance.
okay.
That's that's when the private sector steps in. If you don't have those prior steps, those big breakthrough things don't happen.
Okay, Phil, what would be your response to that?
Well, I think we can look to history here. I mean, yeah, certainly government has a distortive effect when it invests in one specific industry. Yes, certain yields come out of that. But the question we need to ask is what is missed in the process here? What doesn't occur because the government is taxing one group of people to support a specific targeted industry? And there are innovations that never happen because that money was diverted elsewhere in the economy. We look to the late 19th century, which is often cited as like this high watermark of tariff protectionism, and in some degrees it is in the United States. And the claim is made that tariff protectionism coincided with an era of industrial growth, and to some degree, yes, it did. But actually, if you look at the different products, those that are tariffed and those that are not tariffed, it turns out that there's a faster growth rate in things like utilities and electrification compared to something like steel, which is historically one of the major products that we have put heavy protection on. So you have like a natural experiment that's actually playing out in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of the most innovative industries happen to be those that are most insulated from the tariff system that is claimed to be this mechanism that brought us prosperity in that era. So I think there's actually a lot more complexity that's going on here, besides the notion that saying, hey, we just turn things over to a government bureau and it picks the right product to invest in the future. China does it that way, yes, but China also has economic problems right now. They publicly report massive GDP growth. If you ask any economist who studies China and looks at indirect indicators, they're probably fibbing about their numbers, adding 3 or 4 percentage points on top of the actual number of GDP returns in a given year. So yes, we can take the government bravado that's coming out of China, or we can take economic reality and compare it to what we actually see on the ground. And I think there are two very different stories here that get back to this pretense, the notion that the government can possesses the knowledge to know what innovation is going to be in the next century. And I'm actually just very skeptical of that.
Yeah, and I'm gonna ask a question, but then I want to go to Ian for hear your response. I would love examples if you're like, this is an example of where the tariff happened, and this is why we're better off from Americans. Because I'm looking at this conversation to be like, I want America to thrive, and I want my family to thrive, and we'll thrive if America thrives. So that's like that could be a faulty thesis, and you can tell me if that's wrong. The other question I have that I want to go to in a second is tax credits
Yeah.
and tax incentives. They feel like a similar area of like we incentivize things that we have, and I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a negative thing. We want to incentivize people to have kids. We're going to give a credit. We want to incentivize people. So is that different, or is that the same thing? And that's gonna be like another conversation around this idea. But before that, Ian, I'm curious from your point of view. Is there any talking points that you have? Any responses? And can you
Yeah,
give examples? Yeah.
I could critique a dozen things that Phil said, but just as an example of dubious logic, looking at different industry growth rates is not an apples to apples comparison because industries grow at different rates for a vast number of reasons: speed of customer adoption, evolution of technology, alternatives in the marketplace, and so forth. So you can't just say this industry grew faster without protection than this industry that had protection, therefore it's a bad policy. Now, the more important issue I want to address is Phil loves to bring up something that we hear from free trade anti-industrial policy critics all the time, which is the accusation that we propose to have the government, quote, pick winners, okay? We don't. Or there might be a very, very small number of exceptions, but 99% of the time, we're not in favor of the government doing anything that picks any particular company or group of people to make a profit. Picking industries and picking technologies is not the same as saying, okay, Ford, you're going to be the producer of tractors in the United States, and because we've said so, this is what's going to happen. Totally different thing. If you're asking which industries are important, it's not actually a big secret. There's not all that much controversy globally about which industries are significant, which technologies have promise is a bit more controversial, but as Mark said, you have a portfolio approach. Now, I freely admit that I'm operating here on the premise that climate change is real, and yes, electric cars therefore will be the future, but that's a discussion for another time. Picking technologies is not picking winners. Picking industries is not picking winners. And it's not some super subtle rocket science. Everybody can see what it is you've got to have a strong position in.
Ian, do you have an example that we can look at history and say that including government tariffs improved Americans
Sure.
or America revenue?
Sure. Space launch. One of the things that free traders and opponents of industrial policy will always tell you is that you can't have America first sourcing. You have to be able to source all your components from around the world. Otherwise, you won't get the best at a competitive price. For reasons having to do with the fact that a rocket that launches satellites is so similar to a rocket that launches nuclear weapons, America's rocket industry, by which I mean SpaceX, Blue Origin, the whole thing, has been rigorously screened for decades against having components from China, Russia, and other adversaries. It is even more rigorous than a commercial tariff because you have all the tough security agencies of the U.S. government involved in it. And what have we seen as a result? Oh, we've also had massive government investment in the spaceflight industry, everything going back to the start of the space age and the first rockets which were launched by the government. What do we have now? We have a U.S. space industry which literally has no peer abroad. There is no company in China remotely comparable to SpaceX. Nobody has reusable rockets. Nobody has a cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit comparable to what they do. We not only have, under a protectionist industrial policy industry, we not only have the best in the world, we have the cheapest in the world. And we can keep it that way. That's a classic counterexample to the idea that government is only ever this bumbling, corrupt nuisance that screws things up.
And you would say Elon Musk wouldn't be able to do SpaceX because of he's off the shoulders of all the investment that the U.S. has done in NASA. But you could also look at it and say, well, Elon is outperforming government agencies because he's being a lot more efficient.
You can't, because what you said it first, right? The first way you said it, which is he stood on the shoulders of work that the government had done. That's an example of what I talked about earlier. Government needs to invest and do the initial research and development of the technology to the point where the private sector risk tolerance and investment and how long they can wait for an investment to pay off. When it enters that world, that's when government should no longer be in it. And that's
Okay,
what's
Phil,
actually.
I'm gonna hand it over to you to address that, and then I'm gonna then ask about the 25% aluminum tariff
Yeah.
and your guys' thoughts on that. So, but Phil, your response.
Well, I think so. You cite something like the space industry, and I'd point out two factors of it. First off, it's not representative of the typical sector of the economy in which tariffs are applied. Space industry is very particular to both military applications and high-tech commercial applications. The second thing I'd point out about it, you're citing the space industry as this example of supposed benefits of protection, although the policies you're citing in particular on that really actually pertain to sensitive technologies and security around them. The space industry itself grew up in the era of the greatest trade liberalization in American history, the post-World War II period. Between 1945 and really the 2010s, we've had an overall downward trajectory in average tariff rates and a trend toward worldwide global tariff liberalization. Now, yes, we can say that maybe there are some arguments that certain components of sensitive technology, nuclear missiles, things like that, should absolutely be scrutinized and placed under different regulatory systems than, say, steel or clothing or backpacks or automobiles that are coming across the border. But you can't really point to this very strange, unique, exceptional industry as a justification for tariffs across the board. Now, you do note that you say that you aren't picking winners and losers. So the question I'd pose there, if that's the case, how come every time a tariff is proposed as policy, all of the industries in the beneficiary sector descend on Washington, D.C., open their checkbooks, and start writing checks to congressmen as campaign contributions in order to secure that favorable tariff? It sure seems like they're viewing the policy as picking them as a winner, and it certainly seems like other people that are harmed by the tariff. So, for example, we take steel. Steel industry will lobby in favor of tariffs for itself and spend campaign contributions and lobbying expenses in order to secure them. But steel is also an input to the automobile industry, and whenever a steel tariff is threatened, what does the U.S. domestic automobile industry do? They also descend on Washington, D.C. and lobby in the other direction. Why?
Well,
Because they're going to be excluded if you pick steel as a raw input as a winner. They're going to actually have to incur some of the costs of that tariff, and it's in their interest to lobby against it. So every decision you make is allocating resources one way or another through the political system, and just by the very practice of doing that, you're opening up the decision-making process to being lobbied, to being campaigned for, and that's when the winners and losers actually enter into the equation.
Let's take your example. The steel cost in a car's averages $200. So, and the steel prices went up about 2.4%. So what is that, $8? Okay.
Fair enough. $8
Okay.
spread across every single car in America? That's a
Yeah,
lot of cars.
yeah,
And Detroit certainly wasn't happy about it.
but you had, yeah, they always squawk, but they're not too upset about
Okay,
this.
so why are they the losers and the steel industry's the winner, though?
Because there are going to be more people with better incomes who will be able to buy more and more expensive cars if you protect and allow these industries to thrive instead of losing them to China, where people take.
Steel industry employs a couple, maybe 10, 15,000 people.
Well,
300 million people have cars.
this is an
I
example.
mean, what's the trade-off here?
The trade-off is that you're producing long-term investment and long-term growth, which reverberates through the whole economy. A tariff on steel is not a whole industrial problem.
So why not invest that in cars in Detroit? Why not invest that in the manufacturers that use steel as an input?
Well, they should be tariffed. downstream products that use steel should also be tariffed, so that the U.S. manufacturers that use steel as an input aren't disadvantaged by imports that are made from cheaper steel abroad. So that was a failure of the initial Trump tariffs, but they did fix that. They did move the tariffs down the chain of users.
So tariffs on everything until you hit where? The consumer?
No, tariffs on every industry that is being threatened that you want to sustain or rebuild or create.
Again, decided by politicians
Well,
who
who
are
else?
picking winners and
Who else?
losers.
Politicians
And
make
we're back
major.
to the same point.
If we don't decide which industries, China will decide. You keep assuming there's a background here. Your comments are made all against a background, which assumes there are no.
How much steel do we import from China right now? It's a negligible amount compared to our major trading partners. It has been basically since China entered the WTO in 2001. You go all the way back to 2001, China is never at the top of the major steel exporter to the United States list. It's always Canada, Mexico, Brazil.
They've been transshipping their steel. Once we cut it up, made it harder to import. They transshipped it, including now on a large scale, Mexico. That's why there was an agreement, even after the new treaty was negotiated, that set quotas for the steel coming in from China through Mexico. Mexico's completely disregarded that agreement and is putting steel mill factories, for example, steel pipe factories out of business. You just can't assume, you seem to be assuming that we're functioning almost
I'm
as
looking
though.
at the data here, and last year the United States sent more steel to Mexico than Mexico sent to the United States. They actually had a steel deficit versus where we were.
So,
I don't,
so Ian, I wanna get you in here, and this we're talking about steel. Trump just imposed a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports into the United States with no exceptions. That's my understanding. Number one, do you support that? Do you think and then can you add a little color commentary on your thesis on this? Because yeah, I'm hearing both sides, and I understand that it sounds like it's going to make things more expensive by 25% of anything that uses steel and aluminum, and it sounds like that potentially could pass on to the consumer. So I wanted to understand your thought process around your thoughts on that, and then how this is a good thing, if you do agree with Trump's tariff, on how this would be a good thing for the United States.
Before I do that, I just want to address something that Phil said. Phil said a few minutes ago that when a tariff is mooted for an industry, that industry immediately starts showering politicians with contributions and so on and so forth. I'm afraid that's an illustration of how the free trade side just doesn't have a very good set of facts, because I just read in the newspaper yesterday that the president of Ford Motors don't want a tariff on cars. So I'm afraid the basic logic of what observably happens just isn't what your theory predicts. Now, moving on to the steel tariffs, the United States has to face the fact that steel is in a glut globally, both because of the mercantilism and industrial policies of foreign countries like China. They overproduced. We cut them off our market. They dumped into other countries' markets. They then start dumping into our market. And the guiding principle for both steel and aluminum was it's estimated that for this very capital-intensive industry, you need to be running the plants at 80% of output or above for their long-term viability, because you have to make enough money to be able to afford to maintain things, to be able to afford to keep up the skills of your workforce, to be able to afford to move forward with incremental innovations in the technology, and so forth. So that's what Trump did in his first term. And the steel and aluminum tariffs were, as Mark previously said, studied in great detail. And what we got was a significant increase in investment in U.S. production and jobs in return for a very small one-time raise in the price. Now, you need to have strong domestic competition if you want to keep prices under control. I absolutely agree with you that imposing a tariff and then failing to do your antitrust work at home would be a disaster. But if you have an external tariff and fierce internal competition, that's why the U.S. didn't stagnate behind tariff walls in the 19th century. Now, returning to the steel example, since the problem was at least partially solved in Trump's first term, events and patterns have shifted. So now we're back to the same problem. And that's why Trump is talking about bringing back a steel and aluminum tariff. We have to have these industries. The national security argument alone, as far as I'm concerned, for these industries settles it.
Ian, so in summary, you're almost saying that it would be problematic to the security of the United States if we did not have steel or aluminum. If we got that, we would be at the mercy of potentially other countries that could turn it off if we went to war. So I'm just am I tracking with the logic that you're saying? Am I articulating? Okay. We need to move on. I want to give Phil the ability to respond to that, but then there's a lot of other things I want to do with the time that we have left. Phil, how would you respond to the 25% no exception steel tariff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I keep going back to the point. The dominant sectors of steel importation into the United States are not China. They are not hostile nations. It's Canada. And in fact, we're doing more to antagonize Canada by putting the steel tariff in place for what I would argue are basically incoherent reasons. I mean, Trump has floated everything from protectionism to a weird belief that he thinks Canada is somehow ripping us off to asserting that this is leverage to make Canada the 51st state and bring them into the fold by luring a tariff exemption over them. It just doesn't make any sense here on what he's trying to achieve with this, unless you're just saying we need steel tariffs for tariff's sake. The national security arguments that are raised here in the steel industry, this is something that steel and its iron predecessors have been invoking since 1789. They've asserted that we need protection to build us up this robust industry domestically that we can't get otherwise through trade abroad. I ask the question here. I look at something like this as like, when is steel ever going to come into its own in the United States if it hasn't in 225, 250 years of this same policy being sought after, which again, I think also goes back to the political question here. The very term lobbyist itself, do we know where this comes from? It's 1824 when Henry Clay proposed one of the earliest of American protective tariffs. All these representatives of companies descended on the lobby of the Capitol building to hand out cash and favors, seeking a favorable rate for themselves. The 19th century experience with tariffs, whatever else you say about the revenue component of it, one thing it is notorious for is its close connection to and attraction toward political special interests. This is a pervasive feature of 19th century tariffs. It happens time and time again with steep political repercussions. The McKinley tariff in 1890 is seen as so much of an overreach, it causes his entire party to be thrown out of the majority in Congress in the next year. The 1909 Payne-Aldrich tariff, corruption becomes so notorious over it, the political backlash to it becomes so strong that they actually adopt the income tax as a way to wean the country off of the corrupt lobbyist-infused tariff system. The Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930 consists of lobbyists descending on Washington, D.C. to get favorable rates in this measure that's supposed to protect us from the emerging Great Depression. And essentially what it does is it becomes like a race to the bottom where you can't actually extract yourself from a very problematic piece of legislation after it's passed. And Congress recognizes this 4 or 5 years later. They start saying, well, we've really screwed up. Let's hand the tariff power over to the executive branch, precisely because they knew they couldn't get out of and get away from the political corruption that descended on Washington every single time they revised the tariff schedule. So basically what it comes down to is, when you're opening the door and offering these goods, offering these favorable tax rates to certain industries by penalizing their foreign competitors, yes, the lobbyists are going to appear in Washington, D.C., and they're going to entrench it in ways that we don't anticipate and that are also politically impossible to get out of unless you're involved in a long, drawn-out battle of competing industries that are, again, seeking to obtain favors from Congress.
So you're willing to have no tariffs at all and willing to open our markets to a country like China, which will itself pick which industries they think are the most advantageous, the most high value, that they think will lead to the best long-term economic futures, economic dominance, and their military power, and let them decide which ones we will have and which they have, because when they subsidize the ones they choose and we don't protect ourselves, that's what's going to happen. We're going to make the stuff they don't want to make. Is that the future that you envision?
Well, you keep posing this hypothetical, but we look back to the reality. We are not importing significant amounts of steel or aluminum from China. It's coming from Canada. The policy is directed toward Canada.
Yes.
How is taxing steel from Canada going to position us in a better place against China? It just makes
What
no
about,
sense.
you can list things, the machine tools, we invented flat screens, they're not manufactured here. And there are a whole bunch of trade tactics used by other countries to take over those industries. There are a whole list of them. And China just does it on a larger scale. You seem to be prepared to accept the consequences of that. I don't. I don't want to live in a country which
Well, you're
makes
presenting hypothetical consequences that are not happening.
they are happening. Look
So
at the
how much steel did we import from China last year?
deindustrialization of this country that's taken place over the
We,
last 30 years.
we imported less steel from China than the Netherlands. Is the Netherlands a major steel producer? No.
Has the country not deindustrialized in the last 30 years or
In
not?
manufacturing data, absolutely not. Yes, certain industries have deindustrialized, but we actually have more manufacturing output today than we did 30 years ago.
Ian, you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, and then I
Yeah.
want to go on to
First, I
more
want
questions
to
for Ian.
take on the issue of corruption that Phil raised earlier, which is very important because we do need to be realistic about the political aspects of anything we propose. Now, one of the reasons why Mark and I did so much research in our new book on U.S. history is we wanted to look at how did tariffs get set in the 19th century when they were one of the country's signature economic policies and very successful. And it turns out that they're set by a political process. This is not Japan in the 1960s where you had technocrats making these decisions. So it's political. And you know what? Most of the tariffs that were set were correct. Sugar was a mistake. Sugar is still a mistake. The United States, for some reason, has always had a ridiculous tariff on sugar. Look it up. We could talk about it another time. The rest of the tariffs were very, very close to what you can say with 2020 hindsight America should have done in, say, 1830 or 1870 or whatever. And there are reasons for this. The first thing is outright scum-sucking corruption ticked off too many people for special interest to get away with it on an excessive scale, because you do activate consuming interests whenever you propose a tariff. So you come in and lobby for a tariff on iron ore, the iron producers will lobby you to keep the tariff down. If you get a tariff on apples, the producers of apple pie will tell you, no, we're going to lobby that to have it down. As a result, the corruption, although it certainly did exist, and America in those days was notoriously corrupt in a lot of domains of policy with nothing to do with trade, America's trade policy was not hopelessly bent out of shape by corruption. I've given you one reason. The other reason is that the kind of industries that America used to apply the most serious tariffs on were the rising manufacturing industries of the day. And the U.S. had a lot of those because we had the world's most advanced consumer market. We had the highest percentage middle-class population, which was pulling our economy into the advanced manufacturing industries of the day, which was exactly what we should have been doing. So, will there be corruption if you allow a tariff today? Sure, but there are good reasons to believe that it will be kept in check by opposition to tariffs. And as I said before, it's not a secret which industries are important. We know that producing cars is a strategically important industry and producing T-shirts is not. Okay? This is not a very difficult decision to make. The politics is difficult, complicated, and there's a million complexities in implementation. But in terms of what an advanced economy looks like, that's pretty much a matter of agreement from Tokyo to Topeka.
All right, we're gonna move on. I think we could talk about this all day long. I appreciate your both perspective here. Here's my initial thoughts, and I'm gonna ask you this, Phil, first. Is I see Trump as kind of a mob boss from the standpoint of like he's like threatening Canada with tariffs, Mexico with tariffs. I don't think he was actually planning on. I think he used it as a negotiation tool, which seems like it would backfire majorly if it didn't work. But to date, it seems like Trump has kind of gotten his way as it relates to negotiating. So what would you tell the people that are like, hey, Trump has imposed these tariff threats and he seems to be getting people to close up the border, fentanyl, like all these things. What are your thoughts around that? Do you think it's a Trump he's bluffing and it's working right now until it doesn't? Or do you think it's just we're making enemies with our neighbors to the north and the south?
So Trump is definitely using it at certain times as a negotiating tool, but I don't think he's as good of a negotiator as he thinks he is. We can take the case of the first tariff that he threatened against Canada. He said this is over fentanyl enforcement. Look at the DEA's website. How much fentanyl came into the United States from Canada in the last year? It was less than a suitcase. It's like 0.2% of all fentanyl coming into the United States crossed the northern border, and that's a very large border. It's actually not a crisis. Second, what did he get in return for this? He says, okay, we're going to demand enforcement from Canada. Justin Trudeau, who supposedly caved to him, read the terms of what Justin Trudeau offered in return. It's the exact same plan that Trudeau agreed to with Biden on December 17th, 2024, and posted all over the Canadian government's website. Trump declared that's a victory. I look at it and I say, this is political rhetoric. But in the meantime, what's he done? He's soured relationships between two allied nations. Weirdly, he's thrown a bone to the Trudeau government, which was teetering at the brink of collapse and is probably going to get thrown out in the next election up there. But at the same time, Trump is just pursuing kind of like this reckless course for very little gains in return. Then he turns around a week later and says, oh, by the way, we're no longer using it as a negotiating tool. I have tariffs for a different reason, a protective reason, because we're worried about steel from China, but you, Canada, you're actually our biggest steel importer into the United States. Therefore, we're going to put a tariff on steel. Canada's probably looking at this and asking the question, like, what is this guy up to? Because he's contradicting himself in his stated goals, his stated negotiating tactics, and the stated policies that he's actually carrying through on. That just brings chaos, uncertainty, and bad will and animosity between two countries that should be peaceful and have historically been trading partners on a very reliable basis.
Mark, what would be your response? And then I also want to get to your guys' thoughts around tax breaks and all.
To say that this is an area of agreement with Phil.
Hey.
That and the corruption of the sugar industry. I agree completely on that as well.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, that's amazing.
We advocate nothing like that in our book. We're not talking about those uses of just using them as bludgeons. No, in politics, nothing's off the table. Okay. But that's not our focus. We're trying to, do what's good for the U.S. economy long term.
Yep.
Not broadly based prosperity and a great future 10 years from now, not ending up as a colony.
Okay, so let me ask this next question. So I think of the tax code as complex, super complex, but the idea is incentivize what you want. So like the example of having kids, we want to have more kids, we're going to incentivize that. The government doesn't want to build real estate, we're going to create incentives for people in the free market to build real estate. You know, if you look at the tax code, it's a lot of people say it's loopholes, but at the end of the day, they're incentives, and the hope would be that the government is getting a better end of the deal to have someone else take that on. Phil, do you like or endorse these incentives as relates to tax breaks, credits? What is your thoughts on that? And then I'm going to hand that over to Ian and hear his perspective. And then Mark, I'm going to mute you while you're not talking because we're getting a little bit of feedback.
Yeah. So my general philosophy of taxes is that the tax system itself should be low, not economically burdensome and onerous, transparent, easy to identify, easy to enforce, and generally operate in such a way that is not extractive of a toll on the economy, and yet also provide enough revenue to fulfill the basic functions of the government. I think we're all in agreement on that. This, I think, raises the question of why we switched from the tariff to the income tax system. Well, it turns out tariffs are historically popular, not just because of all of the reasons that we've been discussing here. Tariffs were historically a favored tool of taxation because they're easy to enforce at the border at a time in economic development when you don't have the means to actually collect something like an income tax. And we see this in the world today. What countries draw the majority of their revenue, or a sizable part of their revenue, still from tariffs? It's mostly extremely underdeveloped economies, a lot of them in Africa, or it's places like Venezuela that are basically economic basket cases, still use tariffs as a major source of tax revenue because it's the one point that they can actually successfully enforce. Now you move into an advanced economy, something like the income tax becomes a much more practical tool to actually implement because you have means to enforce it by deducting straight out of the payroll, by having employers participate as part of that deduction process. By having a uniform system that everyone knows April 15th they file their tax returns. So it's not only just a question of what the level should be, it's about the complexity, it's about the transparency of the system. And I think one of the things, even though I'm in favor of income tax cuts, I'm generally skeptical of the income tax as a huge redistributive system. One thing that it actually does seem to function well at doing is raising revenue at a pretty robust level in a way that everyone understands exactly what they're paying, when, and where.
Yeah, so you would not be in favor of taking out the 16th Amendment and if not having income tax. You're in favor of having some type of income tax.
My caveat there is I would not be in favor of adding other taxes on top of the existing income tax system unless at the constitutional level we were going to completely alter and reform the 16th Amendment.
But you would be in favor of that?
So if we could abolish the 16th Amendment, yes, then let's talk about other types of taxation. If we
would you be pro-tariff if there was no income tax?
Potentially, I'd consider it.
All right, Ian, I want to hear your thoughts around tax incentives. Do you endorse that? And then I would also like to hear your quick take on, would you want to abolish the income tax, and could tariffs, because that's what Trump has been throwing out there. It's like external revenue service, and everyone loves when other people pay their stuff. You know, if these big corporations can pay my taxes, I'm all for that. What would be your take on those two things? And know that we have about 5 minutes, and then we got to wrap this up.
Okay, I want to begin by agreeing with Phil that tariffs in the U.S. today wouldn't throw off enough revenue to fund the entire government or even to abolish income tax. You could certainly fund a tax cut of whatever percentage. The other thing I would say is that the issue you've raised now is actually discontinuous with our earlier discussion, because you're talking about the generic concept of U.S. tax policy. Now, the first thing I will say is a lot of that simply turns on what spending profile and level you favor for the U.S. government, because If you believe there should be a lot of spending, there's necessarily going to be a lot of taxes. And if you believe there should not be a lot of spending, you can get the opposite result. The problem with that eternally is that the government's major spending items are war, pensions, medicine, and debt. And all four of those, there are very serious reasons why it's very hard to cut our defense budget in the face of a building second Cold War. Cut the medical budget. Okay, well, good luck unscrambling the U.S. medical system, which has defeated the efforts of some of the smartest people in the country. Pension, Social Security. You're going to cut Social Security. Really? I dare you. And then debt. So the U.S. has already incurred this debt, and you have to pay the interest rate you agreed to. Otherwise, you collapse your financial markets. So this idea that you could cut spending to the point where you could just finance it like it's 1832 and you do everything with tariffs, no, that's just not mathematically there.
Yep.
In terms of the issue of, did you want to say something, Mark?
Question about using tax breaks.
Yeah. I would love to hear, Mark, your thoughts on using tax breaks.
Well, you know, there are some differences between direct government spending, say for research or pilot projects, or paying for the manufacturing extension program for small businesses, and using tax breaks. In some cases, you can do one or the other. They both work. There are cases where tax breaks don't work because there's no revenue to take it against, for example. And there are cases where you need to be more specific in terms of what you want, in terms of portfolio investments, still not picking a company. So, but basically they have similar, not exactly the same, but similar effects. If you're willing to acknowledge there's a role for one, there's also a role for the other.
Yeah, and you're not in favor of abolishing income tax. You don't think that'd be a great idea, Mark?
Well, I'm not a tax guy, but I think that's a pipe dream. I mean, that's really
and I tend to agree with that. I don't necessarily. I'm not banking on this happening. I can dream about it. Last question for you all is predictions. We're just getting started with Trump's second term. What is your prediction? Phil, we'll go with you first. What is your prediction of what we will see over these next 4 years with the economy, with taxes in general, tariffs? What's your prediction?
Yeah. So start with the good, and I'll say something in favor of Trump. He does seem to be taking a more conscientious approach in this term than he did in his last on reining in government waste. So the other side of the revenue equation, and this is thing like the Doge. Now, we can debate the tactics that they're using, but at least there's some attention to this problem that's being paid. On the other hand, he seems to be entering the term using tariffs much more aggressively and right out the gate. This is something that in his previous term, they actually had a more prolonged debate. It wasn't until 2018 that we got our first really aggressive major tariff policy under Trump. And that worries me because I think he's already caused plenty of concern and turmoil on Wall Street with his contradictory messaging here. And again, I guess to kind of bring it back to the point that I made to start us off, then Trump needs to really hone down on his message around the tariff and figure out which of these three competing and often in tension goals he's actually using them for, because the longer he continues vacillating between the three, the more uncertainty there is, the more turmoil there is, the longer it will take for the rest of the world to figure out what he's doing and actually respond to it. Even if we disagree with what he does, it would be better to have certainty with what he plans to do rather than this chaos of flipping between negotiating tactics, revenue and external revenue service, protection, and then back to negotiating tactics all in the course of a single week.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Ian, we'll go over to you. What's your prediction on what to expect?
When I wrote my first book, one of the things I learned is that you can make generalizations about broad patterns that are going to happen in the future, but specific events are too dependent on other contingent human decisions. So it's just a waste of time. It's a party trick. What I will say is that the days of trying to understand the Trump administration by taking as your base premise that the guy's a blithering idiot are over. The guy pulled off the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States. I'm not a Trump supporter, but the man is not an idiot. I have to assume, therefore, that when he does crazy things, there's method to the madness. So I have pet explanations as to why he did the Canada-Mexico thing. There's not time for them now. But I would above all emphasize, figure out what the guy thinks he's doing, why he thinks it will work, who told him to do it, what he thinks the objectives are, what he thinks the posturing is, what the feint is, what the sequence of anticipated back and forth is. That's the way I would go about figuring out what's going on the next 4 years.
And thank you, Ian. Mark, we left the best for last, man. You land the plane here. Do you believe that inflation's going to be a thing? And I want to hear your thoughts on Trump, but do you believe that inflation's going to be increased in the next 4 years due to his decisions?
I can't really speak to that. There's so many factors that go into whether we're going to have inflation or not, and I have no expertise on that. But I will sort of pick up the baton here on what I think lies ahead in terms of the areas we're talking about. I think tariffs are here to stay, and I know a lot about the people who are working on that in this administration. They're my view, they're quite intelligent. I think they will be elaborated, refined, but they will find them in many different places where they're needed and they're where they haven't been for a very long time. Secondly, and very importantly, it looks like there's a strong kernel of interest in bringing down the dollar to a level, to the correct level. What's the correct level? It's a level of balances trade, because that's the way those exchange rate markets are supposed to work. That's new, and I think that will become, it'll get into the Overton window, and we'll start working on it. What I'm most afraid of is, I think what maybe Phil likes, is that we'll take a meat axe to government spending programs, like, for example, NIH. That's a crown jewel of American industrial policy. It produces the most productive new drug industry in the world. It's very profitable, hires people at very high salaries, and not that it couldn't use improvement. All these bureaucracies can use improvement, but slashing away is not the way to do it. And I hope that it doesn't go that way.
Well, maybe we'll have you guys back on and talk about why the U.S. dollar should be less valuable, because I'm ignorant on that. That doesn't sound like something I like, but I want to be open-minded to that. And then I for sure think we can all agree that, we should cut unnecessary spending, but obviously there's things that are necessary. I think that's where the debate lies, is what is necessary. And there's a lot that could be unpacked. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being on. I feel very grateful to learn from you all, and from the just bottom of my heart and our whole community. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing where you guys go in the future. We'll have any links and anything that you want us to promote down below. And so including your contact info if you want that. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this, you can check out the description below to get more information on all of our guests. Guys, thank you.
Very well.
Thank you very much.